All right, good day everyone. I'm going to make a few comments on the beginning of Lorraine Code's book Ecological Thinking, and also Elvin Cruz's presentation on the introduction, first chapter of the book. So thank you, Elvin, for putting up your notes, and I've got them on the screen right behind me here. So if I look away every once in a while, it's because I'm reading what you had to say here. So you give a bit of background of Lorraine Code. That's great. She is somebody who I've known for many years. She's Canadian. She got her PhD in Canada and worked for a long time at York University, which in Canada is a very good kind of philosophical and critical theory type of place. And she's been down to UCF to our department a number of times. So we're quite familiar with her work. I did not assign the book solely because of those reasons. I also happen to think that it's one of the most interesting treatments of some of the issues that we're dealing with that actually exists out there. So it's not simply because we know her; it's because I think she brings up a lot of really important issues. So. I think, in this book, it follows on an earlier book of hers called What Can She Know? Lorraine Code is a very important person in the development of what you might think of as feminist epistemology. And we might think, what is that? I mean, if you haven't studied that, it might seem like a strange kind of thing. The kinds of questions it takes up are questions about the issue of the sources of knowledge, the placement of knowledge, the context of knowledge, things of those sorts, and argues that, in fact, women's ways of knowing can and should, but have not generally made a major contribution to our understanding of how epistemology itself works. Now, if you study kind of classic analytic epistemology, you'll know that the bulk of it is what we might think of as normative epistemology, and by that I mean an approach to epistemology that in a certain sense prescribes what knowledge ought to look like. All right, so it looks at what is the nature of truth. How can we talk about truth, and how can we clarify what that actually means? And then once we clarify it, we ought to hold that version of truth. It looks at issues of justification. It looks at all sorts of issues like this that really have to do with the question of what constitutes adequate knowledge. How can we know that we know something, as opposed to, let's say, having an opinion about something or just a belief or whatever. And so, that's a lot of what epistemology has focused on in the 20th century. Long history before the 20th century as well. There was a movement. It started with people like Willard Quine at Harvard and some others of what we might call naturalized epistemology. Naturalized epistemology looks not at what knowledge ought to be, but what knowledge is. Okay, and so it looks at how we actually know rather than looking at what constitutes the basis for reliable knowledge. And some people might say, well, is that philosophy anymore? I mean, isn't that just psychology, or isn't that just some other kind of pursuit? And it does bump against the edges of other disciplines without question. I think there's a very strong argument for seeing naturalized epistemology still being within the purview of philosophy itself. I think the questions of how we come to know are relevant to the questions of how we ought to know. And so Lorraine Code is one of those who is really working at trying to bring naturalized epistemology into the kind of purview of the epistemological questions themselves. And for her, naturalized epistemology must necessarily take into account issues like women's ways of knowing and other situated ways of knowing. I mean, any situated way of knowing. What does it mean to know from a place or from a context or position? So I think that's kind of behind what Code is trying to do. And so what she's doing in this book is proposing a kind of model for how you might do that. And what you're going to see as you get further on in the course, when you get to my paper towards the end of the course, is that I'm doing something rather similar to what she's doing, although using different people. I mean, I use Aldo Leopold. Both she and I use Deleuze, and we're going to be doing a little bit of Deleuze in this course. But we both take up the question of what it means to take situatedness seriously in knowledge, and how that has implications for public policy and ethics and things of that nature. And so Code is quite, I mean, I think she's quite extensive on setting up her approach. We can certainly see echoes of people we've already looked at throughout this course. I mean, I think there are echoes of Aristotle in what Code is doing, without question. There's certainly echoes of Gadamer as well. She is not one who is going to give us a version of knowledge which is very abstract like Comte. And so we can see here, and later on it's going to be quite explicit. We're going to see her being quite hostile to a Comtean sort of approach, a kind of positivist sort of approach. And so what she's going to do here, I think, in this book is try and set up an account of knowledge that is responsible to its situation, that has always in view it has its eye towards ethics in some sense. I mean, it's a responsible knowledge in that sense. And because of that, also, it's going to have its eye towards social policy and social theory. A word about feminism in general. I mean, some people balk at that word. They might think that that's, a particular political stance or something like that. And as with Marx, I would say leave your assumptions to the side for the moment. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of feminism. Feminism, in my mind, is simply a position from which to think and to speak. And I think, I don't hold to the notion that there is some abstract position that, somebody can speak from nowhere or speak from, the universal experience or something like that. I think we all do come from places. And, so this is an important place. And I think the fact of the history of feminism is especially important. I mean, I think it's one of the most interesting and has made a really serious contribution to thought. And it did so because it moved from being what a lot of people think it is, which is simply a kind of tribalism or a kind of, arguing, special pleading of some sort, people just arguing for their own benefit or something like that. It moved from being like that towards something much more interesting, which is picking up questions that would not otherwise be askable or available from another point of view. And I do think that feminism has made major contributions, and Code herself has made major contributions to asking questions that would not easily be accessible or available if we suppose that we're taking a kind of universalist stance or something like that. I see the same thing happening, starting to happen, at least in African philosophy, an area that I work in. Why should we take Africans seriously? Well, that's been the question for centuries for European philosophers. And I think the answer to that is that, there's a presumption in philosophy that you can speak from the universal, you can speak from nowhere, as it were, when in fact, if you look at the production of concepts, if you look at where concepts actually come from, they come from conversations that have particular kinds of questions. They're responding to particular, in some cases, historical situations or philosophical currents of various sorts. I mean, even when we think about European philosophy, we really, that's a bit too vague an umbrella. We really should be looking at British and French and German, and even British. I mean, there's a difference between Scottish and what's going on in London during the Enlightenment, let's say. Different again in Ireland. So, I mean, there are different conversations that, when those conversations run their course and then start coming into contact with other ideas, with those differences produce sparks. They produce the new concepts that have become important through time. And so I think feminism is another thing like that. I think it's speaking from a place, not only one place, of course. I mean, women is half the population of the earth, over half. So it's not like it's designating that as a category is necessarily all that informative to begin with. But, I think it starts us on the way, and I think feminism has done a great job of this, starts us on the way of thinking, well, what would it look like to countenance a set of questions that were not easily askable, or think about a set of concepts that don't really seem all that important, let's say, from another point of view. And so, to take an example, within feminism, there's what's called the ethics of care. Well, that's not something that, when we thought about ethics through the 19th and early 20th century, people thought a lot about, but when feminists came around, they said, look, there's a model of human care that is modeled on maternal love, families, things of that nature, that you just simply don't find within ethical discourse, within, classic modern ethics. You do find it with Aristotle, of course. The question of the family and how the family works is his oikonomia, his economy, his, the notion of the order of the household is where we get the word economics from. So Aristotle certainly thinks about it, but, modern thinkers don't particularly think about it. And so, one of the contributions of feminism is to say, look, there's something here that has been missed, and that it's not just been missed in terms of being an example that needs to be accounted for. It's been missed at a much more basic level. It's now something that actually changes how we think about doing ethics in that case. And so, I think what we have going on here throughout this book is something like that. I mean, feminism, when we think about feminism, we need to think about it as a kind of creative space, not simply a kind of reactive movement. Okay, so put away your Rush Limbaugh or whoever is saying things about feminism. I mean, it's a big, broad movement. There are crazy people there. There are brilliant people there, just like anywhere else. And we're looking at, I think, one of the interesting contributions. Doesn't mean that we won't find ways to disagree or to question or something like that. I mean, that's not the point here. It's not that we just take an idea because it comes from, Lorraine Code or some other feminist and say, oh, it must be right because it's feminist. No. I mean, this is a critical space. This is a space where we have new things to think about. And Code herself kind of supports that. I mean, she talks about the kind of Deleuzian notion that the point of philosophy is to create concepts. That's I think a very powerful way to think of philosophy, and one that's not often thought about. I mean, we sometimes think about philosophy as creating systems or creating arguments or defending propositions or something like that. And I think those maybe are on the way to creating concepts, but they're not, they're not in and of themselves the necessary kind of definition of what counts as philosophy. I think Deleuze is absolutely right that what we philosophers do, I mean, if you think about biologists as having as their focus the processes of life, you have to ask yourself, what does philosophy do? I mean, what is our focus? What do we look at? And I think one very strong candidate, I think probably the right candidate, is that we consider concepts. Once you start considering concepts, you have to start considering how they relate to other concepts. And, once you start thinking about that, you have an ecology. This is where Code is getting her notion from, this notion of an ecology as a metaphor for thought. She's trying to use it like a kind of broadened system in which there's a kind of sustenance for concepts. On pages 28-29, where she defines her notion of ecological thinking, she says this: "My brief for ecological thinking conceives of it as infusing, shaping, and circulating throughout the social, material, intellectual, affective atmospheres, like the air we breathe. Ecological knowings are enacted and ecological principles derived within a transformative, interrogating, and renewing imaginary." And there's a somewhat awkward word there. It actually comes from Lacan. So she defines it: a loosely integrated system of images, metaphors, tacit assumptions, ways of thinking, a guiding metaphorics that departs radically from the imaginary through and within which epistemologies of mastery are derived and enacted. Now, it's a very important sentence for her because she is trying to put against her model this notion of what she calls mastery. And so it's what we're going to see coming through positivism, certainly coming through certain ways of doing science in the 20th century. Not always. I mean, she's not anti-science in this. It's very important to understand that. What she has a problem with is supposing that the goal of science is mastery. She is by no means the first person to point that out. She is, I think, fairly original in figuring out a kind of model for dealing with that, though, and that's her ecological model here. So she's the other thing to note about that when she talks about an imaginary, this loosely integrated system of images, metaphors, tacit assumptions, and ways of thinking. Well, if you think about the way classic epistemology is done, it doesn't take most of that stuff into account, right? I mean, it doesn't take images into account. It's really a question of, like I said before, what counts as justification, what counts as truth, how do we distinguish opinion from knowledge? I mean, these sorts of kind of classic questions. Code wants to bring a whole lot more into it than that. I mean, images, she is arguing in a certain sense that our epistemological ideas are sustained by the images that we, consume, if you wish, or live amongst. And so she's broadening epistemology. That's part of the kind of naturalized turn that she has here. She's broadening it to say that you can't just ask what ought to be knowledge or what ought to count as knowledge. You have to ask what sustains it. You have to start from what's in the world, as it were, and ask how do we make sense out of what counts as knowledge? And once we do that, then we have a way in to think about knowledge in a more abstract or universalizable manner. She's still a philosopher, and she's not going to move away from, reaching towards universalizability and so forth. But her starting point is somewhere else, right? Her starting point is with particulars. Now, how does she do this? Elvin talks about in chapter 1, talks about her, brings up Rachel Carson and Karen Messing, and talks about Gilles Deleuze. And so I guess the question is, what's the point of bringing these people in? I think that's something worth talking about within the discussion area of this module. A couple of things I will say. Rachel Carson is usually not thought of as a philosopher. If she is thought of as relevant to philosophy, she's thought of as, proposing a kind of approach to environmentalism. But Code is using her in a much more philosophical manner than she has been used in the past. A little bit of background here. Need to work up to Rachel Carson in a certain sense, because if you've done any environmental philosophy at all, I think this might be familiar to you. But if you haven't, it's important to understand there are a number of currents that have come to define contemporary environmental philosophy. One of them is what you might think of as a British current, and it has to do with the issue of the rights of biological entities. Okay. And so in the 19th century, there was a lot of talk about what was called the anti-vivisection movement. Vivisection was experimentation on animals, basically. And so a lot of people, including John Stuart Mill and many others, were anti-vivisectionists. Okay, they thought that we ought not to do this. Why? Because animals feel pain, and we ought not to inflict harm on anything that can feel pain. All right. So what's important to note about that is that that's a kind of, that movement is an extension of rights past humans to, it's what you might call the expanding circle, what some environmentalists call the expanding circle. Okay. So we've expanded it now to animals. So that's a particular train of thought that you have that runs through environmentalism. Anything can feel pain, has a set of rights, has a set of responsibilities on our part, and so forth. Now, move to North America. You have people like John Muir, okay, famous person who sets up the Sierra Club, who was a major environmentalist in the early part of the 20th century out in the West. You have people like Aldo Leopold. Leopold writes a book called the Sand County Almanac. Sand County Almanac is just this, it doesn't come across as a philosophical work. It comes across as a work of a naturalist who was out in the world, which is exactly what he was, and just observing the world, and he generates an ethic out of that in the Sand County Almanac. What's interesting about the American strand is that it did not necessarily take up the British strand of the notion of expanding rights or expanding duties. to anything that can feel pain. What it moved towards was the notion of the biosphere, or the notion of the ecosystem, whatever you want to call it. So Leopold, for example, was a hunter, right? I mean, he was a hunter. He had no problem in going out and hunting. Now, from a British point of view, you're inflicting harm on an animal. From Leopold's point of view, you are looking out for the ecosystem. Sometimes culling a herd is harmful to an animal but good for the ecosystem. And so there's that other layer of focus for environmentalism. And in a certain sense, Lorraine Code is working within that space. She's working within this, not the space of duties towards other beings. There's a bit of that there, but mostly what she's interested in is the notion of our responsibilities towards systems. And Rachel Carson fits squarely within that tradition. I mean, you know, Silent Spring and her other works are very much about the harm that we are doing to the environment as a whole. I mean, she was the one that was against DDT, for example, and things like that in the early 60s, from a scientific point of view, should be said. And so she got a bunch of legislation enacted because it was bad for the ecosystem, not simply bad for specific biological beings or something like that. It certainly did have effects on biological beings. I mean, you know, the whole point of Silent Spring was that there are no birds in the spring because all their eggs have been weakened and they're unviable because DDT weakened them, right? So the birds all died off, so there's no bird song in the spring. That's where the name comes from. So, you know, so when Code is using someone like Carson, she's really placing herself within that kind of tradition of ecology. And I think, you know, it's a tradition of relatedness. It's a tradition of betweenness, of exchange, you know, all of those sorts of things. It's, you know, it lends itself towards a certain kind of economic analysis, because economies, after all, are that as well. Economies are systems of exchange too. And so, you know, she's very much within that American ecological tradition, you know, in the way she writes here. She's using, it should be said, you know, people like Foucault and Deleuze and others in that, you know, to that purpose. But she's arguing that there's something to be said for a kind of systemic level set of relations that is not reducible to just to the individuals within that space, right? So, you know, when she's thinking about knowledge, when she's thinking about epistemology, that's what she's thinking about. She's thinking about that you know, that space that's you know, going to be a space of interaction and interrelation. And see, that's where mastery becomes a problem, right? I mean, if you have a system of mastery, what you really have is a system in which that relationship is broken. I mean, one part of the relation takes predominance. That is my intentions, my wants. So I think that I can, you know, turn the ecology into my own playground, or into my own, you know, kind of that Heideggerian notion of standing reserve, right? I can turn the whole thing into a you know, nothing but electrical power or something like that. Well, you know, I'm both embedded within the system, but then I rise above the system, or I pretend that I could be above the system, and turn it into something for my own purposes, and then that breaks the whole thing down. That kind of, you know, my image is like a, you know, a dying coral reef or something like that. You know, all of that interaction just, you know, it's nothing, looks like nothing but concrete after that. You know, so it's, you know, I think Code is operating within that space, and what we're going to see her do throughout this book is to try and flesh out very, very broadly and thoroughly just how epistemology is rooted within that system of interactions, in that kind of virtual space, that kind of space that comes alive when the relationships are actually acting together. So there's this other notion of autopoiesis, Francisco Varela. This is often used within cognitive sciences. That notion that a system has effects that are not predictable or reducible to the parts of the system itself. The famous one is the brain producing consciousness, right? So we've got all of these synapses and all these interactions. Can we find the place where consciousness exists within that? No, it has to be the whole thing working together, and we get something that's greater than the sum of the parts. Some people resist this. They think of it as mysticism or something like that. I don't. I think that's unfair. I think there's something more interesting going on with that. Doesn't mean that we're absolved of trying to explain or talk about those, but I think someone like Code is fleshing out that kind of space quite nicely. So. So in the module here, please please pick up some of those themes. I'm interested in what you think about what Code is trying to do here. Obviously we've got more to go in the book, and we'll be reading the whole thing. So we'll see how she makes her argument throughout the book. But I think that's some of the background that is going on here. So have at it. I'm happy to see what you have to say. Talk to you soon.